The black dress felt foreign against my skin as I smoothed it over my hips for the third time that morning. 62 years old, and I was adjusting my funeral attire like a nervous bride. The irony wasn't lost on me. After 38 years of marriage, I was finally the center of attention at an event involving my husband, Richard, and he was dead. I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror, the same one where Richard used to check his tie before heading to his business meetings. The woman staring back at me had hollow cheeks and eyes that had forgotten how to sparkle. When had I become so small? When had I learned to make myself invisible in my own home? The doorbell rang, sharp and demanding. Through the peephole, I saw my son Paul's broad shoulders blocking the morning light. Next to him stood his wife, Alexis, her blonde hair perfectly styled despite the early hour. Even at a funeral, she managed to look like she'd stepped out of a magazine. Mother. Paul's voice was flat as I opened the door. No embrace, no comfort, just that word, mother, delivered like a formal title rather than a term of endearment. Paul, sweetheart, we need to talk about the arrangements. He pushed past me into the foyer, Alexis trailing behind with her signature expression of barely concealed disdain. The funeral home called. There's been some confusion about the seating. I followed them into the living room, the same space where Richard and I had hosted countless dinner parties, where we'd argued about money, where he'd promised me things would change. The coffee table still held yesterday's newspaper, folded to the obituary section. Richard's photo smiled up at us, all charm and silver hair. What kind of confusion? I asked, though something cold was already settling in my stomach. Alexis perched on the edge of the sofa, like a bird ready to take flight. Well, Hazel, there's the matter of protocol. You understand. Hazel, not mom, not mother-in-law. Just my name stripped of any warmth or respect. Paul ran his hand through his hair, a gesture that reminded me painfully of his father. Dad had relationships, people who were important to him, people who deserved to be recognized. Relationships. The word came out smaller than I intended. Don't make this harder than it has to be. Paul's voice carried a warning I'd heard countless times over the years. The same tone Richard used when he wanted me to stop asking questions about late nights and weekend conferences. Alexis cleared her throat delicately. We think it would be best if you sat with the extended family. You know, to make room for, well, for people who are more recently significant in Richard's life. The silence stretched between us like a chasm. I could hear the grandfather clock in the corner, the same one Richard's mother had given us as a wedding gift. Tick, tick, tick. Each second marking time I'd never get back. More recently significant, I repeated slowly, tasting the words like poison. Mom, please. Paul's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something that might have been shame. You know about Mary? You've always known Mary. The name that had haunted our marriage for the past 15 years. The secretary, who became the business partner, who became the woman my husband spent his Wednesday evenings and Saturday afternoons with. The woman who bore him a daughter, while I sat at home making excuses for his absence at birthday parties and anniversaries. And their daughter, Alexis added, her voice sugary sweet with false sympathy. Little Ava is only 12, Hazel. She needs to be with her father's real family today. Real family. The words hit me like a physical blow. I gripped the back of the nearest chair, my knuckles white against the dark wood. I am his real family, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I was his wife for 38 years. Paul shifted uncomfortably. Look, we're not trying to hurt you. But Mary, she was with him at the end. She was the one holding his hand when he died.
Not you.
Because I hadn't been called. Because I'd been at home making his favorite soup for when he returned from his business trip while he suffered his heart attack in another woman's bed. The car will be here in 20 minutes, Alexis announced, checking her phone. We're riding together to present a united front. You can sit with Aunt Marie and Uncle Pedro. I watched them move through my home like they owned it. Paul straightening his tie in the same mirror where I'd questioned my reflection moments before. Alexis touched up her lipstick, completely at ease with the devastation she'd just delivered. Actually, I said, my voice finding strength I didn't know I possessed. I'll drive myself. Paul frowned. Mom, that's not. I'll drive myself, I repeated, each word crisp and clear. I'll see you at the funeral home. They exchanged a look, the kind married couples share when they're questioning someone's mental state. But they didn't argue. They simply gathered their things and left, Paul calling over his shoulder that they'd save me a seat in the back. Alone in my house, I walked to the window and watched their luxury sedan disappear down the street. The same street where Richard and I had brought Paul home from the hospital 35 years ago, where we'd pushed him on his first bicycle, where we'd waited up for him after his first date. I went to the bedroom and opened Richard's closet. His suits hung there like empty promises, still carrying the scent of his cologne. On the top shelf, behind the golf shoes he'd never used, I found the box I'd discovered 6 months ago but never confronted him about. Letters from Mary, photos of their daughter, bank statements showing the money he'd been moving from our accounts to hers, and a copy of a will dated 3 years ago that left everything to his beloved wife, Hazel Bell. I sat on the bed we'd shared for decades, holding the evidence of my husband's double life. But something had shifted in me during Paul and Alexis's visit. The woman who had spent 38 years making excuses, accepting crumbs, and pretending not to see the obvious was gone. The woman who remained was someone else entirely. I stood up, smoothed my black dress one final time, and walked to the phone. There were calls to make, arrangements to confirm, and a performance to give. But first, I needed to understand exactly what I was walking into. The funeral director's voice was professionally sympathetic when I called. "Mrs. Bell, I'm so sorry for your loss. I did want to clarify the seating arrangements. Your son mentioned there might be some special considerations." "Yes," I said, my voice steady. "I wanted to confirm that the front row on the left is reserved for the immediate family. That would be myself, my son Paul, and his wife Alexis. Actually, ma'am, I have a note here that Mrs. Mary Reed and her daughter Ava were to be seated in the front row along with your son and daughter-in-law. You were to be seated in the second row with other relatives." The phone felt heavy in my hand. "I see. And who made this arrangement?" "Your son, ma'am. He said he had your approval." I hung up without another word and walked to my jewelry box. Inside, nestled in blue velvet, was my wedding ring. The one Richard had placed on my finger in front of God and our families, promising to love, honor, and cherish me until death did us part. Death had done its part. Now it was time for me to do mine. I slipped the ring into my purse and headed for the door. The woman who had been pushed aside, diminished, and erased was about to make her final appearance. But the woman who would emerge from this day would be someone entirely different. The funeral home parking lot was already crowded when I arrived, my hands steady on the wheel despite the storm brewing in my chest. Through the windshield, I could see people I'd known for decades filing into the building. Neighbors, colleagues, friends who had shared dinners at our table and celebrated holidays in our home. How many of them knew about Mary? How many had been complicit in the lie that was my marriage? I sat in the car for a moment, watching Paul and Alexis emerge from their sedan. She straightened his tie with practiced efficiency, her diamond wedding ring catching the autumn sunlight. They looked like the perfect couple, the successful son and his ambitious wife. No one would guess they'd just relegated his mother to the status of a distant relative. Behind them, a silver BMW pulled up. My breath caught in my throat as I watched her step out. Mary Reed, the woman who had been sharing my husband's bed for 15 years. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe 50, with auburn hair and a figure that hadn't been softened by decades of marriage and motherhood. She wore a navy dress that was respectful, but not mourning. As if she understood her place in this theater of grief, a girl emerged from the passenger side. Ava, Richard's daughter, his other daughter. She had his eyes, the same gray-green that had once made me fall in love with him, 12 years old and already taller than I'd been at her age, with a kind of natural grace that comes from never having to apologize for taking up space. I watched Paul approach them, his embrace warm and familiar. Not the stiff formality he'd shown me this morning, but genuine affection. How long had he been playing the role of protective older brother to this child while treating me like an inconvenience? The sight of them together, Paul, Alexis, Mary, and Ava, formed a tableau of betrayal so complete it took my breath away. They looked like a family, his real family, as Alexis had put it. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror one more time. The woman looking back at me had spent 38 years being the perfect wife, the understanding mother, the one who never made waves. But that woman was about to be buried along with her husband. Inside the funeral home, the viewing room was already filling with mourners. I recognized the setup immediately. Richard's casket at the front, surrounded by elaborate floral arrangements that spelled out beloved husband and devoted father. The irony of those words wasn't lost on me. The funeral director, a thin man with kind eyes, approached me immediately. "Mrs. Bell, I'm so sorry for your loss. If you'd like to follow me, I can show you to your seat." "Actually," I said, my voice carrying more authority than I'd used in years, "I'd like to speak with Mr. Warren Kirk first." Warren Kirk, Richard's lawyer for the past 20 years, the man who'd handled our wills, our real estate transactions, our financial planning. He was already here, standing near the front with his briefcase, dressed in his usual somber suit. "Mrs. Bell." Warren's handshake was firm, his expression carefully neutral. "I'm very sorry about Richard. He was a good man." "Was he?" I wanted to ask, but this wasn't the time. "Warren, I need to understand something. Richard's will. When was it last updated?" His eyes flickered, a tell I'd learned to read during years of dinner parties where business was discussed over dessert. "Mrs. Bell, perhaps we should discuss this after the service." "When was it last updated?" I repeated, my voice sharp enough to cut through his professional deflection. He glanced around the room, clearly uncomfortable. 6 months ago. But really, this isn't the appropriate time. 6 months ago, I felt something cold settle in my stomach. After he'd been seeing Mary for 15 years, after their daughter was born, after he'd moved money from our accounts to hers, Warren's face went pale. "How did you?" "I found the papers, Warren. All of them, including the previous will from 3 years ago that left everything to his beloved wife." I stepped closer, close enough to see the sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. "What I want to know is what changed 6 months ago." Before he could answer, I heard Paul's voice behind me. "Mother, what are you doing?" I turned to find him standing there with his makeshift family, all of them looking at me with varying degrees of concern and irritation. Mary hung back slightly, her hand protectively on Eva's shoulder. The girl stared at me with curious eyes, and I wondered what she'd been told about the woman who'd been married to her father for longer than she'd been alive. "I'm talking to Warren about your father's will," I said calmly. "I think it's time we all understood exactly what Richard intended." "This is hardly the time or place," Alexis began, but I cut her off with a look that made her step back. "When is the appropriate time, Alexis? After you've already decided where I sit at my own husband's funeral? After you've already determined I'm not part of his real family?" The conversation was drawing attention. I could feel the weight of curious stares, the whispered conversation starting to spread through the room. "Good. Let them watch. Let them see." Mary finally spoke, her voice soft but steady. "Mrs. Bell, I know this is difficult. Do you?" I turned to face her fully for the first time. "Do you know what it's like to watch your husband slip away year by year, excuse by excuse, lie by lie? You didn't know because you didn't ask. You assumed. You decided that because your father had a younger woman and a prettier daughter, his first family didn't matter anymore." The words hung in the air like incense, heavy and impossible to ignore. "The seating arrangements will be corrected," I announced, looking directly at the funeral director. "I will sit in the front row as his wife. The rest of you can arrange yourselves however you see fit." I turned to walk away, but Warren caught my arm gently. "Mrs. Bell, there's something else, something you should know before the service." I paused, feeling the weight of every eye in the room on me. Richard left instructions, specific instructions about what he wanted said today. He wanted you to know. He wanted everyone to know that his greatest regret was not being the husband you deserved. The confession hit me like a physical blow, but I didn't let it show. Not here. Not now. Then he should have tried harder while he was alive, I said simply, and walked toward the front of the room to claim my rightful place. The front row felt like a throne reclaimed. I sat with my spine straight, my hands folded over my purse, where Richard's wedding ring weighed heavy against my palm. To my left, the seat where Paul had planned to put Mary remained conspicuously empty. She had retreated to the third row with Eva. Her earlier confidence shattered like expensive china against concrete. Paul sat beside me, his jaw clenched so tightly I could hear his teeth grinding. Alexis flanked his other side. Her perfect composure cracked just enough to show the calculation behind her carefully constructed sympathy. They had gambled on Richard's will, reflecting his wandering heart, and they had lost spectacularly. The service began with Reverend Jesse Hall speaking about Richard's complicated legacy, a careful euphemism that fooled no one. I watched faces in the crowd as he spoke, some nodding in recognition of truths long whispered, others shifting uncomfortably as they reassessed 38 years of dinner party conversations and country club gossip. When it came time for eulogies, Paul stood first. His speech was everything you'd expect from a grieving son, measured, respectful, full of carefully edited memories that painted Richard as a devoted father and successful businessman. He spoke of fishing trips and football games, of the lessons his father had taught him about integrity and perseverance. The irony was so thick it was almost suffocating. "My father taught me that family comes first," Paul concluded, his voice breaking slightly. "That the people you love deserve your loyalty and protection." As he returned his seat, I felt something cold and sharp crystallize in my chest. The audacity of his words, spoken just hours after he'd tried to banish me to the back row of my own husband's funeral, was breathtaking. When Reverend Hall asked if anyone else wished to speak, I stood. The sanctuary fell silent. Even the soft sobbing from the back rows stopped as 200 pairs of eyes focused on me. I walked to the podium with steady steps, my black heels clicking against the marble floor like a countdown. "Thank you," I began, my voice carrying clearly through the hushed space. "Many of you knew Richard as a colleague, a friend, a neighbor. You knew him as a man who could tell a good story, who never forgot a birthday, who always picked up the check at dinner." Scattered nods of recognition rippled through the crowd. But I knew Richard as a husband. For 38 years, I knew him in ways that most of you never saw. I knew him when he woke up at 3 in the morning panicking about business deals. I knew him when he cried watching our son graduate from college. I knew him when he was afraid, when he was proud, when he was lost. I paused, letting my gaze sweep across the faces before me. I found Mary in the third row, her tissues crumpled in her hands, her face pale with understanding. I also knew him when he lied.
Va.
The silence deepened, became something you could cut with a knife. Richard was not a perfect man. He made choices that caused pain, that broke promises, that shattered trust. He lived a double life for 15 years, believing he could compartmentalize love, that he could have his cake and eat it too. Paul shifted beside me, but I didn't look at him. I couldn't afford to lose my momentum. Now, some of you may wonder why I'm sharing this here today in front of all of you. Why I'm not preserving the fiction, maintaining the facade, keeping the family's secrets locked away where proper widows store their grief. I gripped the edges of the podium, feeling the solid would anchor me. I'm telling you this because Richard asked me to. The murmur that went through the crowd was audible now, whispered questions and sharp intakes of breath. 6 months ago, when Richard updated his will, he also wrote me a letter. He gave it to Warren Kirk with instructions that it should be read only after his death, only if I chose to share it. I reached into my purse and withdrew a folded piece of paper, Richard's familiar handwriting visible through the cream-colored stationery. He wrote, "Hazel, if you're reading this, then I'm gone. And you're probably angrier with me than you've ever been. You have every right to be. I've spent the last 15 years trying to live 2 lives, believing I could love 2 women, raise 2 families, and somehow make it all work without destroying everything I'd built with you." My voice remained steady, but my hands trembled slightly as I held the letter. "I know you know about Mary. I know you've known for years, and I know that your silence wasn't approval. It was grace. Grace I didn't deserve. Patience I never earned. Love I repeatedly betrayed. You never made me choose because you knew the choice should have been obvious. It should have been you. It should have always been you. Mary was crying openly now, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Ava looked between her mother and me with the bewildered expression of a child watching her world reshape itself in real time. I'm leaving everything to you. Not because I want to hurt Mary and Eva, but because you're the one who earned it. You're the one who stayed through the bankruptcy scare, who held my hand through surgery, who covered for my mistakes at company parties when I'd had too much to drink. You're the one who never gave up on us, even when I had. I folded the letter carefully, my movements deliberate and controlled. Richard asked me to tell you all this because he wanted you to understand something important, that actions have consequences, that choices define us, and that the people we hurt along the way deserve acknowledgement, not just our regret. The sanctuary was so quiet I could hear the heating system cycling on, the distant sound of traffic outside. He also wanted me to tell Mary something specific. I looked directly at her, seeing the fear and hope warring in her eyes. He wrote, Mary gave me joy when I was too stupid to find it in my marriage. She gave me a daughter I love deeply, but she also gave me the clarity to understand that what we had was built on what I was destroying with Hazel. I can't undo the damage I've done, but I can try to ensure that my death doesn't compound my mistakes. I returned to my seat, leaving the congregation to process what they'd heard. The silence stretched for long moments before Reverend Hall cleared his throat and moved to the closing prayer. But I wasn't done. Not yet. After the service, as people filed out offering their condolences, Paul caught my arm. His face was flushed with anger and embarrassment. How could you do that? He hissed, keeping his voice low enough that the lingering mourners couldn't hear. How could you humiliate us all like that? I looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time in years. When had my son become this person? When had he learned to value appearance over truth, convenience over loyalty? I didn't humiliate anyone, Paul. I simply told the truth. Something this family stopped doing a long time ago. You made Dad look like a fool. Your father made himself look like a fool. I just stopped covering for him. Alexis appeared at Paul's shoulder, her face a mask of controlled fury. Do you have any idea what you've just done? The whole town will be talking about this. Our reputation. Your reputation? I laughed, a sound that held no humor. Your reputation was built on lies, Alexis. On the fiction that we were the perfect family, that Richard was the ideal husband. That I was the understanding wife who didn't mind being second best. Mom, please. Paul started, but I cut him off. No, I'm done being pleased. I'm done being understanding. I'm done being the woman who makes everyone else comfortable while she disappears. Mary approached us slowly, Eva's hand clutched in hers. Up close, I could see she was younger than I'd thought, maybe 45, with laugh lines around her eyes and a softness that came from never having to fight for her place in the world. Mrs. Bell, she said quietly, I want you to know that I never intended for things to happen this way. I studied her face, looking for deception, for the calculated manipulation I'd expected. Instead, I saw something I hadn't anticipated. Genuine remorse. What did you intend, Mary? She flinched at the directness of the question. I fell in love with him. I know that doesn't excuse anything, but I fell in love with a man who told me his marriage was over in everything but name. He said you were staying together for appearances, for financial reasons, but that there was no love left between you, and you believed him. I wanted to believe him. Her voice was barely above a whisper. I wanted to believe that what we had wasn't destroying something real. I looked down at Eva, this child who shared Richard's eyes and nose, who had been raised believing her father was free to love her mother without reservation. What will you do now? I asked Mary. She seemed surprised by the question. I don't know. I have some savings and Richard helped with Eva's education fund, but you expected more. She nodded, tears starting fresh. I thought after 15 years, I thought there would be some provision for Eva. She's his daughter, too. The moment stretched between us, heavy with implications. Paul and Alexis watched with barely concealed hope, probably calculating how they could leverage Mary's situation to their advantage. But I had learned something important in the past few hours. Power was not about wealth or wills or who sat where at funerals. Power was about choice, about deciding who you wanted to be when everything familiar was stripped away. There will be provisions for Eva, I said finally. Her education, her future. Richard may not have been wise enough to plan for it, but I am. Mary's eyes widened with shock and gratitude, but I held up my hand. However, there are conditions. The hope in her face flickered, replaced by weariness. I smiled for the first time that day, an expression that held no warmth. The house felt different when I returned from the cemetery, larger somehow, as if Richard's absence had created space I'd forgotten existed. I moved through rooms where we'd shared 3 decades of married life. But the memories felt distant now, like scenes from someone else's movie. I was making coffee when the doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw Paul and Alexis standing on my front porch, their funeral attire replaced by casual clothes that somehow made them look younger and more vulnerable. Behind them, Warren Kirk waited with his briefcase, his expression carefully neutral. "We need to talk," Paul said when I opened the door. No greeting, no attempt at warmth, just the blunt demand of someone who still believed he held some authority in this house. I stepped aside to let them in, noting how they moved through the space with the practiced ease of people who'd been mentally cataloging assets. Alexis's eyes lingered on the antique mirror in the foyer, the one Richard's grandmother had brought from Ireland. Paul ran his hand along the banister as he passed, probably calculating its worth. "Coffee," I offered, my voice pleasant as morning sunshine. "This isn't a social call, Mom," Paul said, settling into his father's favorite chair without invitation. The presumption of it, the casual way he claimed Richard's space, sent a spike of cold fury through my chest. Warren opened his briefcase and withdrew a stack of papers. "Mrs. Now that the funeral is behind us, we need to discuss the practical matters of Richard's estate." I poured myself coffee with steady hands, taking my time to add cream and sugar while they waited. Let them wait. I'd spent 38 years accommodating other people's timelines. "The house will need to be appraised," Warren continued. "And there are the business interests to consider. Richard owned shares in several companies, plus there's the investment portfolio to manage." "I'm aware of Richard Holdings," I said mildly. "I helped build most of them." Paul shifted uncomfortably. "Mom, we know this is difficult, but we think it might be best if you consider selling the house. It's too big for one person and the maintenance costs." "Who is we, Paul?" The question caught him off guard. "What? You said we think." "Who is we?" "You and Alexis. You and Mary. You and your father's ghost." Alexis leaned forward, her voice taking on the patronizing tone she used when explaining things to people she considered intellectually inferior. "Hazel, we're just trying to help you make practical decisions. This house has 6 bedrooms, 4 bathrooms, and a pool you never use. The property taxes alone must be enormous." $28,000 a year, I said calmly, plus another 15 for maintenance, 12 for utilities, and about 6 for insurance. "I've been managing the household budget for decades, Alexis. I know exactly what everything costs." Warren cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should focus on the immediate legal requirements. The will needs to go through probate, which typically takes 6 to 8 months. "No," I said simply. They all stared at me. Warren's pen stopped moving across his notepad. "I'm sorry," Paul said. I said no. The will doesn't need to go through probate. Richard and I held everything in joint tenancy, with right of survivorship. The house, the accounts, the investments, they all transfer automatically to me upon his death. Warren, you know this. You set up the arrangements yourself 12 years ago. Warren's face flushed slightly. Yes. Well, there are still some assets that will require. Which assets specifically? I asked, my voice sharpening. Because I spent this morning reviewing our financial records, and I can't find anything that requires probate. Can you? The silence stretched uncomfortably. Alexa shot Paul a look that was pure calculation, and I realized they'd been counting on a lengthy probate process to give them time to contest the will or find loopholes. Look, Mom, Paul said, his tone shifting to the wounded son routine that had worked on me for 35 years. We're not trying to take anything from you. We just want to make sure you're taken care of. Taken care of, I repeated slowly. The way you took care of me at the funeral, the way you've taken care of me for the past 15 years, while your father was building his second family. Paul flinched. That's not fair. Fair? The word came out sharp enough to cut glass. You want to talk about fair? Let's talk about the Christmas dinners where your father disappeared for 2 hours to check on business, while I kept the turkey warm. Let's talk about the anniversary parties where he spent more time on his phone than talking to our guests. Let's talk about the nights I sat up waiting for him to come home from client meetings that ran until midnight. We didn't know. Alexis started. You didn't want to know, I corrected. There's a difference. You were perfectly happy to let me play the devoted wife as long as it didn't interfere with your inheritance expectations. Warren shuffled his papers nervously. Perhaps we should schedule a formal meeting next week to discuss. Warren, I said, my voice cutting through his diplomatic deflection. I need you to do something for me. I need you to prepare a new will. Paul's head snapped up. What? I'm 62 years old. I could live another 30 years. A lot can change in 30 years. I want to make sure my affairs are in order. But you just inherited everything, Alexis said, confusion evident in her voice. What's left to change? I smiled, the expression feeling foreign after months of practiced grief. Everything, Alexis. I'm changing everything. I walked to the mantelpiece and picked up a framed photo. Paul's college graduation. All three of us smiling at the camera. Richard's arm around my shoulders, mine around Paul's waist. We looked like the perfect family then. Maybe we even were for that brief moment in time. Warren, I want you to establish a trust for Richard's daughter, Ava. Her education, her health insurance, basic living expenses until she's 25. $500,000 should cover it. Paul's mouth fell open. $500,000 for her? She's your father's daughter, Paul. She didn't choose to be born into this situation. But that's our money. No, I said quietly. It's my money. Richard left it to me, remember? You were quite clear about that at the funeral. Warren was taking notes, his pen scratching across the paper, and the remainder of the estate. I looked at Paul, seeing Richard's features in his face, but none of his father's charm. When had my son become so grasping, so calculating? When had he learned to see people as obstacles to his financial security? I'm setting up a scholarship fund, I said, for women over 50 who want to go back to school. Women who spent decades taking care of everyone else and forgot to take care of themselves. The silence that followed was deafening. A scholarship fund. Paul's voice cracked on the words. You're giving away our inheritance to strangers. Your inheritance. I set the photo down carefully, my movements deliberate. Tell me, Paul, what exactly did you do to earn an inheritance? Did you work 60-hour weeks to build Richard's business? Did you sacrifice your own career ambitions to support his? Did you smile through dinner parties where his colleagues made jokes about his extracurricular activities while you pretended not to understand? I'm your son. Yes, you are. And when I die, you'll inherit whatever's left after I've lived my life on my terms, made my own choices, and decided for myself what my money should accomplish. Alexis was calculating furiously, probably trying to figure out how much would be left after decades of my independent living. Hazel, this is very emotional thinking. You should take some time to consider. I've had 38 years to consider, Alexis. I think that's enough time. Paul stood abruptly, his face flushed with anger. This is because of what happened at the funeral, isn't it? You're punishing us for the seating arrangement. I laughed, a sound that surprised even me. The seating arrangement? Paul, you tried to erase me from my own husband's funeral. You tried to make me a spectator at the end of my own marriage. And you think this is about where I sat? Then what is it about? He demanded. I walked to the window that looked out on the garden Richard and I had planted together 20 years ago. The roses were still blooming, defiant against the autumn chill. It's about dignity, I said quietly. It's about deciding that being a mother doesn't mean being a doormat. It's about realizing that just because I gave birth to you doesn't mean I owe you my self-respect. When I turned back to face them, I saw something I'd never seen before in Paul's eyes.
Fear.
Not the fear of financial loss, but the deeper fear of a child realizing his parent is a separate person with her own will and desires. I loved your father, Paul. I loved him through his mistakes, his infidelities, his broken promises. I loved you through your selfishness. You're taking me for granted. Your assumption that my love was unconditional and inexhaustible. I paused, letting the words settle. But love without boundaries isn't love. It's enabling. And I'm done enabling anyone. Warren closed his briefcase with a soft click. I'll draft the documents you've requested, Mrs. Bell. When would you like to review them?
Tomorrow morning, I said.
And Warren, I want everything legally bulletproof. No loopholes, no challenges, no way for anyone to claim I wasn't of sound mind when I made these decisions. After they left, I stood in the sudden quiet of my house, feeling something I hadn't experienced in decades: complete autonomy. No one to ask permission from, no one to accommodate, no one to consider except myself. I poured another cup of coffee and sat in Richard's chair, my chair now, and began making a list. A real list, not the grocery lists and social obligations that had defined my days for 38 years. Places I wanted to travel, classes I wanted to take, books I wanted to read, the woman I wanted to become. For the first time in my life, I was completely free to choose. Mary stood on my porch like a penitent at confessional, her hands clasped in front of her, her auburn hair dulled by the gray afternoon light. She'd changed from her funeral dress into jeans and a sweater that made her look younger, more vulnerable, without the armor of formal clothes. She seemed smaller somehow, more human. I know you said we needed to talk, she said when I opened the door. I thought maybe it was better to get it over with. I stepped aside to let her in, noting how she hesitated at the threshold, as if crossing into enemy territory.
Good.
She should feel uncertain here. This was my house, my domain, my rules. Coffee. I offered the same politeness I'd extend to any guest, though we both knew she was something far more complicated than that. Please. I led her to the kitchen, the heart of the home, where I'd prepared thousands of meals for a man who was sharing his appetite elsewhere. Mary sat at the breakfast nook where Richard used to read his morning paper, her fingers drumming nervously against the marble countertop. How long have you known? I asked as I poured coffee into 2 cups, the simple domestic ritual at odds with the weight of our conversation. Known what specifically? I turned to face her, letting my silence speak for itself. After 15 years of lies and omissions, we were going to start with truth. She sighed, her shoulders sagging. I knew he was married from the beginning. Richard never pretended otherwise. But he told me the marriage was over in everything but name. That you were staying together for financial reasons, for appearances. He said you had separate bedrooms, separate lives. I set her coffee down and took the chair across from her. The same spot where I'd eaten breakfast alone most mornings for the past decade, while Richard grabbed coffee and a muffin on his way to early meetings. Did you believe him? Mary wrapped her hands around the mug as if seeking warmth. I wanted to believe him. When you're in love with someone, you find ways to justify things that should be unjustifiable.
For 15 years, she flinched.
It wasn't supposed to be 15 years. In the beginning, he said he just needed time to figure out how to leave without destroying you financially. He said you were fragile, that you'd never worked outside the home, that you'd be helpless without him. The description hit me like a slap. Was that how Richard saw me? How he described me to justify his betrayal? The helpless wife who needed protection from reality. And you believed that for 15 years. I kept my voice carefully neutral, but something sharp was building in my chest. I believed it for the first 5 years, Mary admitted. But then things started not adding up, as she stared into her coffee as if it might provide answers. He'd mentioned things about your conversations, your opinions on current events, books you were reading. You didn't sound like the empty-headed housewife he'd described. And then there were the business meetings. What about them? He'd reference decisions you'd made, advice you'd given him about investments. He'd say, Hazel thinks, or Hazel suggested, about complex financial matters. Women who are intellectually helpless don't give sophisticated business advice. I felt a bitter satisfaction that my contributions hadn't been completely invisible, even to his mistress. So, you knew I wasn't the picture he'd painted? What did you do with that knowledge? Mary met my eyes for the first time since sitting down. I asked him about it several times. He always had explanations. You were book smart but emotionally dependent. You were good with numbers but naive about relationships. You were his business partner but not his romantic partner.
And Eva?
Her face softened at the mention of her daughter. Eva was unexpected. I was 37, convinced I'd missed my chance at motherhood. When I got pregnant, Richard was terrified at first, but then he seemed genuinely happy. He said it proved our relationship was real, that it meant something. Did he ever talk about leaving me after Ava was born? All the time, he'd say he was waiting for the right moment, that he needed to make sure you'd be financially secure, that he wanted to do it right. But the right moment never came. I sipped my coffee, tasting the bitterness that had nothing to do with the beans because there was no right moment. There was no plan to leave. There was only the fantasy of having everything he wanted without giving up anything he already had. Mary nodded slowly. I think I knew that deep down. I knew it. But admitting it would have meant admitting that I'd wasted 15 years of my life, that I'd let my daughter grow up believing her father would eventually be free to marry her mother.
What did you tell Eva about me?
That you were her father's first wife? That you'd grown apart but remained married for practical reasons? That you were a nice woman who deserved respect, but that her father's real life was with us? The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. How easy it had been for them to rewrite my existence, to reduce 38 years of marriage to a convenient fiction. Did you ever think about the woman whose husband you were sharing? Did you ever wonder what my life was actually like? Mary's composure finally cracked. Tears started flowing down her cheeks, and her voice became thick with emotion. I thought about you all the time. I hated thinking about you. I'd see women your age at the grocery store or the mall and wonder if they were you. I'd imagine what you looked like, what you did with your days, whether I suspected. I laughed, a sound devoid of humor. Mary, I knew about you before Eva was born. I found credit card receipts for restaurants I'd never been to, hotel rooms I'd never shared. I found jewelry receipts for pieces I'd never received. She stared at me in shock. You knew? I knew. What I didn't know was how to leave a man I'd loved for 23 years, how to start over at 50 with no career, and a son who clearly preferred his father's version of family. Why didn't you confront him? I considered the question, really thought about it. Because I was a coward. Because I thought if I pretended not to see it, maybe it would go away. Because I believed that being the long-suffering wife was somehow noble, that my sacrifice meant something. And now I know that sacrifice without choice isn't noble. It's just waste. We sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of 15 years of deception settling between us like fog.
What happens now?
Mary asked finally. To Eva and me. I studied her face, looking for calculation, for manipulation, for some hint that this conversation was another performance. Instead, I saw genuine fear and something that might have been relief at finally telling the truth. That depends on you, I said finally. What do you mean? I stood and walked to the window that looked out on the garden. The roses Richard and I had planted were still blooming, but the leaves were starting to turn. Soon, winter would come and everything would appear to die. But the roots would remain, waiting for spring for the chance to grow again. Ava deserves better than the lies we've all been living with. I said she deserves to know that her father was a complicated man who made selfish choices. She deserves to understand that love isn't about having everything you want. It's about making choices that honor the people you care about. You want me to tell her the truth? I want you to stop protecting her from reality. She's 12 years old, not 5. She's smart enough to handle complexity. Mary wiped her eyes with a napkin. And the money, the trust you mentioned, that's real. But it comes with conditions, as I said. What conditions? I turned back to face her, seeing not the other woman who'd stolen my husband's affections, but a middle-aged mother who'd built her life on quicksand and was finally feeling it shift beneath her feet. You're going to get a job, a real job, not the part-time consulting work Richard arranged for you. You're going to become genuinely independent so that if you ever fall in love again, it's because you want to, not because you need to. Mary nodded slowly. I can do that. And you're going to tell Ava the truth about our marriage. Not the sanitized version Richard fed you, but the actual truth. That he was married to a woman he loved but took for granted. That he made choices that hurt people. That love isn't enough if it's not backed up by respect and commitment. She'll hate him. Maybe. Or maybe she'll learn something valuable about the kind of person she wants to be. Children are resilient, Mary. They can handle difficult truths better than comfortable lies. I poured myself another cup of coffee, my hand steady despite the magnitude of what I was proposing. There's one more condition. Mary looked up at me wearily. I want to be part of Ava's life. Not as a replacement grandmother or some awkward family friend, but as someone who loved her father despite his flaws, who can tell her stories about the man he was before he became the man who hurt us both. The surprise on Mary's face was genuine. You want a relationship with her? She's Richard's daughter. She's the only good thing that came out of his 15 years of deception. She deserves to know all of her father's story, not just the edited version. Mary stood up. Her coffee barely touched. I need to think about this. Of course you do. But Mary, don't take too long. I'm 62 years old, and I've wasted enough time waiting for other people to make up their minds about what my life should look like. After she left, I sat in the quiet of my house and felt something I hadn't experienced in decades.
Possibility.
Not just the possibility of revenge or justice, but the possibility of transformation, of becoming someone new, someone who chose her own family, her own priorities, her own definition of what love should look like. I picked up the phone and dialed Warren Kirk's office. Warren, it's Hazel. I want to add another provision to my will. I'm establishing a foundation, the Second Chances Foundation for Women, starting over after 50, and I want to serve as the first director. I hung up and smiled, feeling the last pieces of my old life falling away like autumn leaves. Winter was coming, but I was no longer afraid of the cold. I was ready to plant new seeds and see what would grow.